far, we've been talking about services and costs in two big buckets. For a service center, it's only acceptable to allocate service center costs to products or services if they're part of the cost needed to deliver the product or service. So for instance, you may have a technician who's dedicated to one type of equipment and a separate technician who's dedicated to another. It wouldn't be allocable to combine the technician salaries and distribute to the use of both equipment types. For rate setting, you need to evaluate the overall budget expense items and allocate costs to applicable products or services based on the level of use. Additionally, if one service is highly efficient and highly utilized, it's not reasonable for the recoveries of that service to support another less utilized service, or there would be a loss leader, for instance. Products and services should be separately costed, and one should not subsidize the other. This aspect can be challenging in practice, especially when a service center may have many products and services, and detailed tracking of individual expense types would be administratively burdensome. Ultimately, for allocation, the goal should be to come up with a reasonable approach to identify and allocate costs of operations to the proper products and services based on measures that are not administratively burdensome, and then assign costs with associated uses. Okay, final step. We divide expected costs for each product or services by the expected usage for product or service. This slide shows the basic formula: projected cost divided by projected volume, adjustments for past gains or losses, and then an allowance for a subsidy. The part we really haven't talked about concerns that subsidy. What happens is that if your cost per service is more than what your users can afford, or maybe more expensive than what your users could obtain externally, you may need to consider a subsidy. Your immediate answer, if you said, well, we can't operate at a loss, you might say, let's shut down the service. And that might be the right answer. It makes sense to evaluate services and service centers that are not performing at cost. But more often, there's really a need to keep those services in place. So for instance, let's say you have already purchased a large piece of equipment and you just want to recoup some of the costs. Or you're starting up and the user volume really isn't where it needs to be, and if you costed it out, your users couldn't afford the service. Or perhaps you have an animal facility where it's very, very common for those to run at a deficit, but it's such a core service to running research that you accept a certain amount of loss. So in those cases, it may make sense for the institution to agree to a subsidy in order to make the rates more affordable. Ideally, those should be identified up front. That's the key takeaway here, as part of the budgeting and rate setting process, and not something that you are surprised by at the end of the year when you're trying to figure out if there's a surplus or deficit. So in general, there's quite a bit of analysis that can go into rate setting when subsidies, gains, and losses are involved. The most important takeaways from this discussion are to get costs right. Make sure you adjust for over-recoveries in the past, and make sure you're not setting rates so high as to scare away all your potential users.